In this demonstration, we're going to take down SQL Server and we're going to do a complete restore of the database. You might have a catastrophic failure in the database tier, and that's the most dangerous or most disturbing place to have a crash that you have to recover from in TFS. So I'm going to go into a brand new server that I've installed SQL Server on. I've installed, you'll see there's the report server databases here because I did install SQL Server reporting services. But if I look down here, there was no other databases. If I look down here, I see all of these databases, things like the TFS warehouse config, other org, offsite, all of these things that we have had and that we're using as part of our TFS installation. I'm going to take this server, right-click it, and stop that server. That's going to stop the service itself. That is basically taking that box and killing it. All right, we see that is now stopped. If we were here, we can also open up the Team Foundation Server Administration console. And as you can see, it's having a little bit of trouble loading. If we go up and take a look at the application tier, it'll tell us that it could not connect to the database. The database is not operational. Everything's failing. We can't get to it. Can't load things like any of the configuration. We're basically dead in the water at this point. And if we tried to browse out and actually use this, we'd be in big trouble. Notice I can't connect to the database here. It can't grab the version. Can't figure out what application tiers exist. We're in big trouble in this case. So to resolve this, we're going to need to go out and actually grab our application tier where we did the backups and restores from, and we're going to go there and we're going to do a restore. Actually, it might be an even better demonstration if we do it from this application tier where we didn't create the backups, but we can restore from here as well. Let's go into our scheduled backups folder, and we're going to restore databases that were previously created by our scheduled backups. Once it opens, we enter the network backup path, and we happen to be locating everything at SRV 19428/TFS backups. And we can then list those backups. We can see we've got several different backups, including the one that we have taken just recently, the one we took this morning. Let's grab that one, click Next. This lists all of the databases. Now, unfortunately, it's wanting to restore right back to our same instance, but we know that that instance is down. It's no longer going to work. So we need to specify the SQL Server instance that this is going to be targeted to. In our case, that's 19.432. We'll use 432, and we're going to restore all of these databases to it. Let's click Next. Put in the encryption key password. Next. Next. It runs the readiness checks to make sure everything's ready to configure, and we click Restore. All right, it completed with issues. Let's click Next. And we failed to restore the reporting services encryption key. I'm going to have to do that manually after the fact. Luckily, the encryption key doesn't impact our TFS services at all, except for a couple instances where people won't be able to see some of the reports because we need to just go in and update the connection strings, just revalidate the permissions against the connection strings rather, and some subscriptions might now no longer be working if people have subscribed to those reports. But we can go in and restore that encryption key through the reporting services piece. In your case, don't mistype that encryption key and you'll be good. Let's close this, and we have completed it. Notice you may need to purge the version control cache and some of the other things. We're going to be good. We've got it refreshed. Let's go back to our application tier. Okay, up at the application tier, we can now start to see things updating. All right, at the point of refresh, we find that the SQL Server is not available. Unsurprising, let's scroll back down and take a look at the data tier. Data tier summary is still pointing to 19.4.30, which is no longer an active SQL server. So now we need to move it and point it to the new database server. So first, before we do that, let's take a very quick look. Here's our old server and it's down. Here's our new server, the 1432, and let's refresh the databases on that server and notice that now we have a lot of databases. It's moved over and restored all of our things. So now we need to point the configuration database to this. And that's going to require a command line. So let's go to the command line. This is the part we're going to fire up the command prompt for. Blow it up a little bit to make it easier to read. And we're going to use the TFS config command line tool. And there's one here called register DB, and that changes the configuration database. And basically the configuration database is what's pointing to everything else. We need to point that to a different one. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Register DB, pass in the /? to get all the information. And here are the things that we need to pass in. We need to pass in the SQL instance, and that's going to be our SRV 19432, and we're going to pass in our database name, and that's going to be the name of the configuration database. Now the default is TFS_configuration, and that's the name of the one that we've kept it to. So now we're going to remap and point to that database for our configuration. I've got a problem here. I've got the administration console open. Let's go ahead and close that administration console so that we can rerun this command line. Done. We still need to wait a little while, and now we're back in. Now let's fire the TFS administration console open again. All right, once it finishes loading up, you'll see that the notification URL is here, server URL, etc. Let's scroll down. We see the console users, email alert settings, and the data tier summary. Now notice the data tier is off to another location. Here's the data source, etc. We have our application tiers. Both those application tiers exist. And our reporting services summaries. We do need to make sure that we update the reporting services encryption key. I'll go ahead and leave that as an exercise for you. We now are back in, and TFS is back up and running, and we can see that in our application tier. One of the ways to monitor performance of your TFS app tier and potentially your database as well is to use the built-in performance counters. Now, when Microsoft ships TFS, they include a bunch of performance counters that you can use. So in this demonstration, let's take a look at what some of those performance counters are. And to start with, let's just fire up perfmon. Just push start and then type perfmon, and that gives you the performance monitor. If you open it up, we can take a look at the existing performance monitor. By default, it's just the processor utilization time. But we can add our own basically performance counters here. Let's go in, and we might have a user-defined one, and I created one here called TFS data that's just blank for right now. You can right-click here and add a new one if you like. I created one called TFS data that comes with some default ones. Nothing really out of the box and nothing TFS related yet. I just said, give me the default counters. And from here, we can then go in and add some performance data collectors. So I'm going to say this is my TFS app tier potentially, and I'm going to gather performance counter data. You can also gather event data, configuration data, etc. Let's go next, and here's where I'm going to add my performance counters. When you click add performance counters, you're given a selection of all of the performance counters on this machine. Now you'll see everything from the .NET CLR, because it's a .NET application, all the way down to a bunch of IPsec drivers and all sorts of things. What we care about is the TFS ones, and they're all prefixed with TFS. Makes it easy to find because there are literally hundreds upon hundreds of categories of these. So let's take a look at some TFS ones. There's a chat service that's available. There's a code sense service that runs all of our code sense for Visual Studio Ultimate. There's a file container service, a lab management service, a proxy service, which I think is an important one, probably to pay attention if you have proxy services installed. You can look at things like, what is the current cache size? How many file downloads do we have? What is the total cache hits? So basically that's going to be the number of hits when we go and ask for a file, how many are we actually getting back? So we could take total cache hits, for instance, if we like that one, and we could add it, TFS proxy total cache hits, and then maybe the total download requests, etc. And we could do the current cache size if we like. We could add all of those as proxy services. Let's scroll down. We've got more. We've got a few other things, TF services or TFS services. These are things like the average response time for services. This is average response time for all services. Azure storage, downloaded bytes per second, caching service hits. There's all sorts of different things that you can go in here and explore. Now, we're not going to have necessarily a lot that we're going to want to grab from here. You kind of have a specific need when you start to measure it, but this is where you can find those. If you're doing Git work, you can find specifically Git performance counters here. How many fetches per second, commit jobs per second, etc. A lot of different types of things. We can take a look at SQL stats. This is often important. We can take a look at the number of SQL executions per second. Async calls, version control is another one. It's the TF version control, but it's basically corresponds like the Git version control above that's supported. Work item tracking information. There can be some useful ones in here, like for instance, how many active Git work item requests are we having right now? We can add that in and we can see that changing over time. And how many metadata requests are we getting? And we could add those two requests for an example. We could say we want the sample interval to be every 5 seconds for demonstration purposes and finish. We can open it up and we can then start logging these things. They're being logged out to a file and we can get some performance counter data basically based off of these performance counters. Let's go ahead and make sure we start that data collector, and we can do some things like seeing the latest reports, create a new window from here, etc., export our list, view the properties, and all of the other things that you can do from your performance monitor. All right, after the performance monitor returns, we can see some summary things and look at our basic configurations that we have for our report data that we've gathered. In this demonstration, we've walked through some performance counters, how to set them up, how to start gathering data and storing that to a log file, and it can be useful. I do want to take a step back, however, and talk about performance counters. I've managed a lot of TFS servers, and I've only had to go to performance counters probably twice, maybe 3 times in my entire career. Not something that I use on a very regular basis. However, those performance counters are available and they're there. Another tool that you can use, and it changes with each release as well, very often the location, but there's a database that stores transactional data about the performance as well. And you can see a little bit of that data when you look at the URL, which is the URL of your server, :8080 whack TFS whack _OI. And we're going to be demonstrating that when we look at logs, but that's another place where we can see some types of performance data as well as looking with other issues with your TFS server. When we rebuild our data warehouses, it's common that we want to know what the status is. So we're rebuilding the warehouse or the cube, and we need to understand what's happening. Now, as a quick refresher, there's a few ways to rebuild the cube. One is right here with this start rebuild job. It's not going to give you a lot of status. Another way to do it is with there's a TFS config, and that one's got an option for rebuilding the warehouse. That's another way that you can do it. And in either case, it's going to start triggering that run. And one other way is to go out to the actual web service, and that's located at localhost :8080 whack TFS whack team foundation whack administration whack v3.0 whack warehouse control service.asmx. And if you go there, you can also trigger the cube and start processing the warehouse. So we can say, please process the warehouse and invoke that warehouse processing and allow it to begin. We could also go out and tell it to process the analysis database. But what you can do then is get the processing status. There's only one thing you have to enter here, and that's include online hosts only. I'm going to say true here and click invoke. And now it'll give us all of the things that are running. And we can see here, for instance, under this warehouse processing online status, notice it says started, which we would expect. It also has started the analysis processing online. It started that one as well. It could be just coincidence. Currently, the job processing status is idle. It started, but it's waiting for something to happen. So you can take a look at all of the various jobs for Team Foundation, for the default collection, for the offsite collection, and a bunch of other things as well, other org. We get to see all of the various things, and it gives us status as to what's happening. So regardless of how you trigger your data warehouse rebuild, you can go out to this URL and look at Get Processing Status to find out how it is actually running. In this demo, we're going to be walking through using lab management to spin up new environments. Now, we're going to be using Microsoft Test Manager. So fire up MTM, and instead of the testing center, you can drop down and hit the lab center. Now, in a previous demonstration, we've created something in the library. This is a server or a set of servers that sit on System Center Virtual Machine Manager. And we created the Skillsoft environment here. I created a simpler and smaller single server environment for this demonstration, since it spins up a little bit more quickly. Now let's go over, this is a library, and that means we can create as many of these copies as we need. Let's go over to the lab, however, and take a look there. So in our lab, we're going to deploy an environment. Now before we do that, I want to show you the new button as well. So we can go in here and create a new environment. This is an environment that we can use, etc., but then when we're done with it, we dispose of it. It's not a library of templates of machines. It's just one instance. So we can't spin up multiple copies of any environments we create here. Now, we can do a couple things. This SCVMM environment lets us create pretty much like we did in the library, or we can choose a standard environment. And that's what I wanted to briefly mention. If you use the standard environment, you can point to existing machines, your existing test infrastructure, for instance, that can be in Hyper-V, in VMware, they can be physical machines, they can be Azure boxes. It doesn't really matter where they're located. And that's using the standard environment. Other than the difference between a new environment and spinning it up from a template, really that's just an ease of configuration when we spin things up from the template, because we want to maybe create multiples of these, or we want to be able to create them, tear them down, and create another clean copy. But if you just want to keep the machines up and running, this standard environment can be very, very powerful. Now let's cancel that and go back to deploy an existing environment. We're going to choose our single server demo, and we can give our environment a name. We can call this our small environment if we wanted. Whatever we really liked in there. And then we can choose to deploy that environment. When we deploy it, it'll tell you you're about to deploy some VMs. Make sure that you're not spinning up a bunch of machines with the same name and same IP addresses unless you're doing a network isolated environment, which we're not. So let's go ahead and deploy the environment. I'm okay with that constraint. And you can see now we're preparing for the operation deploy the environment. Now that'll create some machines. It needs to do some copying across the network, and sometimes this can take a little bit of time. So we'll go ahead and wait for this to complete. Once we're done spinning up the environment, you'll notice that it says ready, and we can do a couple of things with the environment. We can now automatically deploy to it if we had a lab management build. We can do other sorts of things with it. We can actually connect to that environment by clicking the connect button. And that allows us to actually use the environment viewer to jump in and look at the machine as it exists right now. And once we've connected, we can see what that machine looks like, and we can actually go in and manipulate this machine. Now, one quick note, if this was in a network, in an isolated network, this would be the tool we would use to connect to that isolated network to go in and potentially do some of our testing as opposed to remoting in. But in this example, we've spun up a new environment in lab management and we've connected to that environment. At this point, we can go in and make modifications and manipulate it at will. Sometimes things don't go right in your lab management environment. In fact, it's a very, very common occurrence. Lab management is very touchy behind the scenes, and if there's just a small misconfiguration somewhere in SCVMM, generally you're going to have to go in and repair your environments yourself. So let's take a look at that environment, what it might look like. In this case, I've got my environment. It's the small environment here, and it says it's not ready. In addition to being not ready, there's some additional information that's available right here, and we can view those details here. When we view the details, we'll find that in our particular case, it's saying we must install a compatible test agent on all machines of the environment. Click Install Agents to complete the task. Let's go ahead and do that. We need to provide a username and password of someone who has the appropriate permissions on the machines to do installations. In our case, we have our administrator of the entire domain. We may have individual users, but they need to have permission across all of the machines in our domain. In our case, we can use this one and click OK. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to work, however. Very often, by simply pressing repair, it'll go in, make the communication, set it up, and get everything working for you in the course of the next few minutes to an hour. However, in our case, we're not able to get to them. They've got a couple of potential issues, and we need to go look into those issues. So let's click OK. A couple of them, not running, not available, and the file and print sharing exception are two things. So let's click OK, or cancel that, and then we can connect to that machine. Once you're connected to the machine, you can then log in, and we can see some of those issues that we might be having. Now we're in the machine. If we go up here, we can view the details of that error again, and we must install compatible test machines in the environment. Click Install Agents to complete it. Let's try again. We can specify the administrator of the local machine. Again, we're just doing this. We weren't able to install them automatically, which is a common problem with lab management. But let's give it a shot one more time with the local administrator rather than the domain administrator. Excellent. And now we're preparing for that repair of the environment. For some reason, we weren't able to do it before. We came into this machine, and now it's preparing to do that repair automatically. Excellent. And we've gone ahead, and once it completes, our lab server is ready. We needed to install that piece in there. One quick note, although it happened that we successfully were able to connect and make that happen on this automatically, it's not always the case that it's automatic, and there's a few things that you may need to go in and check. Very commonly, there's errors around whether or not you have file and print sharing open and available. That needs to be open and available on the connection you have, and you have to make sure you have the appropriate passwords and the right permission to go in and run that install. So in our case, we've just demonstrated how to do a repair of the environment using the repair button. In our case, it was an Install Agents button. It does the same thing. And we're now ready to use our environment. When using lab management, you often run into situations where you want to take a snapshot of the entire environment, be it one machine or 20 machines. You really want to be able to say the environment at this point in time was causing problems. We had a bug at this point in time. That sort of a thing is relatively common, and you want to be able to get that snapshot. We can do that right here in our lab management environment. If you fire up MTM and you look at the lab center, here we have our environment, and we might want to be doing things in that environment, potentially testing, etc. We can connect to that environment, and once we connect, we can take a snapshot. Here's our environment, and you'll see that there's a single machine in this environment, and we can view the snapshots that are currently available. And right now, we have no snapshots that are available. Let's go ahead and take a snapshot. And we might call this our initial configuration. It's before we've moved forward. We might want to take a snapshot. What you find is that when you're using a lot of different tools in Visual Studio, snapshots come into play. For instance, during an automated build and deploy into a lab management environment, you can tell it to roll back to a particular snapshot before you do the deployment. So in our case, we might want to roll back to this initial configuration before we do the deployment because it doesn't yet have anything on it. Additionally, you may want to take a snapshot when you're walking through a bug environment. If you have lab management set up and you happen to be using the Test Professional, the tool we're using here, to walk through a manual test, when you create a bug, there's two buttons. One's to take a snapshot, an image of the screen, just a graphical image. There's a button next to it that allows you to take a snapshot of the entire environment at that moment in time, so that when a developer comes back to repro it, they can roll everything back and get the environment at that particular snapshot. So those are some of the uses of snapshots, and they can be taken either when you're doing something like a bug and you just happen to hit that button, or you can come in here and directly create your own snapshots. Once they're created, you can select one and you can roll back to that previous snapshot if you'd like. You can apply that snapshot with this button. So in this demonstration, we've gone through how to connect to an environment using that connect piece right here, that connect button. And then once we've connected to it, we've gone ahead and taken a snapshot of that environment. Lab Management sits on top of System Center Virtual Machine Manager, and although they're two separate applications, Lab Manager cannot exist without having System Center Virtual Machine Manager underneath it unless you're just using standard environments. So SCVMM is a core piece of this, and what I'd like to do is show you the correlation between what we have in Lab Management and also what exists in SCVMM. Let's open up our existing Lab Center, and notice we've got this small environment. It's a TFS Lab 3. It's running here. It's a running environment. We also have our library of environments. We have a single server demo, Skillsoft, a small environment demo. We have various demo pieces here, and these are environments that may contain one or more servers or machines. So we can have multiple machines in each of these. Now, what Lab Center does is it abstracts away some of the complexity of dealing with System Center Virtual Machine Manager, so we can create these environments and actually start several things, not just one machine at a time, and we can kind of correlate those two. So let's take a look at what that looks like. We have this library here, and then if we go to Lab, we have this actual running environment. It's one with TFS Lab Server 3. And if we move over now and take a look at the Virtual Machine Manager, we'll see something interesting. Okay, now we're over at the new machine, the Virtual Machine Manager, and let's open up the Machine Management Console. And the first thing I want to point out is that if we go to these VMs and services, we find that we have some interesting things that are out here and available to us. So for instance, here, this Lab PC1 is running, it's currently running, and it's running in this cloud, and other ones here are stopped. This particular one that's running is tied back to our environment that we had running in our small environment that we had running in Lab Management. And we saw it in Lab Management. It was that one executing machine. So we can see that it exists right here. Interestingly, if you right-click it, you can view its properties. And inside of the properties, you've got the name of the machine. But sometimes that name can be pretty ugly. If you look down here, however, you see that it's a lab management thing, and here's some information about lab management and the project, what environment it came from, what collection, all of those sorts of things. That description is available right here. So you can see that it's coming from your lab management environment. And we can also open up like a TFS Client 2 and look at the properties there. And you'll notice there is no description. This is something that's in System Center Virtual Machine Management and isn't being managed by Lab Management. We can also go look at the libraries. So here you'll see there's a lot of base virtual machines and some other ones, and they're stored in a particular state. They're ready to be fired up. And we have this TFS Lab 3 machine. That's the one I want to point your attention to because it's the environment that we've spun up. And you'll notice it's a virtual machine. It's running this version of Windows. It's got an owner, etc., and it's stored. This is something that we can then spin up and use. We have other machines here, and these virtual machines are ones where we have created them from lab management. Notice they're prefixed with the lab and have a really ugly GUID attached to them. These are ones where we've created environments that are correlated and might be a little bit different than the base ones that were set up for me in SCVMM. Once again, you can notice here that we have in the description field information about where they're coming from. This is a lab management thing. It's from TFS Lab 1 was the base identifier that this particular one was built from. So someone gave me this environment, TFS Lab 1, and then based on that environment, I created some more complicated things, and I took those and made them as libraries as well. So they appear here in the library share of System Center Virtual Machine Management. So in this demo, we haven't covered any necessarily how-tos. We've simply discovered how these things are related, and we're looking at System Center Virtual Machine Manager here and how it is used to support lab management, and also how lab management abstracts away some of the complexity of the underlying technologies used in System Center Virtual Machine Manager. In this demonstration, we're going to be talking about using Active Directory groups to secure Team Foundation Server. Now, you can add individuals and remove individuals from Team Foundation Server, but that gets to be problematic and quite an administrative nightmare. If you're going to move people from one group to another group, or someone gets promoted or they leave the company, we always maintain that in Active Directory. That tends to be the canonical place where everybody has the latest and greatest information, Active Directory. So we want to rely on that as part of our Team Foundation Server security permissions and granting of people access and authority. So if they move from one group to another group, that's automatically picked up by TFS. So to do that, we use Active Directory groups. And earlier on, you saw me adding just a group, a developers group. We're going to dive into a little bit more detail here. And not much, just to show you how that happens. Once again, I'm going to go into permissions from the web, and there are 3 areas we need to make sure that we add those permissions. They're the SQL Server Reporting Services infrastructure that you see here. And to do that, I might add a new role assignment. We have SharePoint, the SharePoint site itself. We can add groups here. And in Team Foundation Server, we can add groups here. Let's go ahead and add groups within this. So for our contributors, we may want our testers to be contributors. But I want to go one step further in this demonstration than simply adding testers into this contributors group. We can create our own TFS group as well. And that TFS group could be called testers. These could be my app testers, for instance. My app testers. This could be a group. We'll go ahead and create that group. And inside of the my app testers group, we can add a Windows group. And we'll use our testers group that's defined in Active Directory. Now, in this demonstration, we're not going to be defining groups in Active Directory. That's something that generally falls outside of TFS administration. However, those groups probably already exist in your Active Directory somewhere, and we can refer to them right here. Let's save changes. And now what that means is inside of my app testers, all of the testers in the organization belong to my app testers. We can also then add app testers into this contributors group if we wanted. So in here, we could say all of my app testers are contributors. And here I would add the TFS group, my app testers. And when I save the changes, you'll see my app testers is granted here. Now, what this means is if we drill into this, what you're going to find is my app testers is made up of the testers group. This all just cascades up very, very nicely. To wrap this demo, I want to just recommend that when possible, you use Active Directory to store individuals and then maintain security by using Active Directory groups. And that lets you get away from taking a dependency on having to manage when an individual leaves one group and to another group, takes a different role, or just leaves the company. You'd like to have that just handled transparently for you by Active Directory. So I'd recommend, when possible, stick with using Active Directory groups inside of your permissions infrastructure in TFS. Sometimes users of TFS really just interact on a very limited basis. For instance, they might just be accessing work items, adding a work item, looking at their bugs that they've submitted to find out if they've been updated and whatnot. And to do that, Microsoft supports users being able to do that through the web, and it's a limited access. It requires no client access license. It's very straightforward, but it's limited as to what you can do. And to find that and make changes to those permission sets, you open up the administration page, and I've gone here to the default collection administration. You might have gone all the way to a team project one. That's quite all right. But you're going to go all the way to the left to the whole control panel to make this change. And then there's an access level tab. Click on the access level tab and you can see the 3 access levels. Limited is the non-cal user permission. And you can see here that they can view my work items. That's all that they really can do. Right now there's no identities. So if Chantel Sands, for instance, tried to log in here, she wouldn't be able to hit TFS at all, potentially. Actually, we've granted her permission to another one. But someone new coming in here, we'll use our Mike as our user. Mike comes in and he tries to get access. If he's not part of the valid users list, he'll just get denied. He'll have no permissions whatsoever. And he won't be able to even file bugs or anything like that. So we would want to add him to this limited users group. They can view their own work items. There's also a standard group, and they can see things like view their work items. They can get their standard features, look at the Agile boards, backlog and sprint planning tools, view charts. And then there's the full permission. This is the one, if you're coming against TFS and you happen to have an ultimate or a premium SKU or several of the other permission levels that allow you to get in here and allows you to do all the things you could do in standard, plus things like request and manage feedback, do test case management right from here, interact with team rooms, author some charts, and do something called Agile portfolio management. All of those things are provided in the full one. By the way, you can set as the default access level full if you like, but you do need to have the right client access licenses to do so. It's not validated or checked, but you need to be compliant. In our case, we're going into this limited group and we're going to add users or groups to this limited one, and we might add everyone. Probably need to check that name. We'll see if it'll save that change. We might need to done the domain name, but we could add everyone to the group. Well, there it is. And now basically everyone in our organization can now hit this website and add new work items or view the work items that they themselves have entered. And that's a cal-less approach. And that's how you go ahead and add somebody. And you could add individuals, groups, or anything to this limited user group. I do want to make one quick comment. As of the date of this recording, we're in August 2014, and it's been announced that there's going to be some substantial changes, and it's going to open up what's available in this free user group, the non-cal user group, relatively substantially in the next few service pack releases and other releases. So I do want to just let you know, you can check Brian Harry's blog for the latest. So this may be changing in the near future. But as of August 2014, this is the limited access. It's just viewing work items that you have created and the ability for you to create work items, but you can't view other people's work items. If you have SharePoint Enterprise, there's something called Excel Services, which is a powerful way to do reporting in Team Foundation Server. What you can do is create your reports in Excel, potentially tying them to the Team Foundation Server cube or anything like that, pull the data in, create charts, create graphs, create whatever it is you like, and then expose those on a portal. And that's what we're going to do in this demo. So to begin with, I've got a site, and I just called it Reporting Demo. Very, very simple site. It's got a Documents folder and Home. Let's take a look at the report that we have. We've got some very simple data pulled from TFS. And it's our bug severity. Let's take a look. And notice we have just some bug severity and some counts of those. And we have the various severities, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and how many are in each of those severities. So something that we can then use. You'll see not too many are Sev 4. There's but a lot of Sev 2 bugs. So that's basically our thing. One thing I want to note is this outline. I've given it a name. Now by default it's chart 1, chart 2, but in Excel you can give it a chart name, and I've called it bug Sev with no spaces, just bug Sev in there. So just to remind you, this is what we are. We're going to try to get this report, which is in Excel, into our SharePoint as a very nice portal. Now to do that, we need to edit this page. So we can go right up to edit and edit the page, and it'll allow us to edit the page. Now we've got a couple areas we can put stuff in, and what we want to do is we want to insert a web part. And there's a web part here. If you go to business data called Excel Web Access, and we're going to add that to the container rich content in our case. We'll click Add. And you'll see it's right here. Now we need to tie that so we can actually see the Excel report. And we're going to do that. We're going to open up the tool pane. And we're going to select that workbook. Now we can go to Documents, Bug Severity, go ahead and insert that. And then we have a named item. If you hit the build here, it doesn't give you much, just a place to type. So it's not very useful if it's fast. So we know it's called Bug Sev. And we can auto-generate a web part title and do a lot of those sorts of things here if we like. We can change the appearance, layout. I'm going to simply apply it as it is. And you'll see that it's brought it into our area here. And at this point, we can close out from this and we can save our page. And now whoever goes to the home page, they're going to see this Excel Web Access, which is the severity of our bug data. And it appears right here. And we can put many of these on a portal. It's a very clean, concise, and easy way to do reporting out of TFS and then just get it exposed as part of your Excel Web Services. So in this demonstration, we've walked through Excel Web Services, and we've taken a pre-existing Excel report and we have uploaded it to Excel Web Services so we could create a portal that people could see it in. When working with Team Foundation Server reporting, there's a lot of different areas and whatnot that we can make changes to. And one of those areas is our SharePoint site. And on the SharePoint site, we may want to configure it differently. We may want to change it. And a lot of this is going to depend on what version of SharePoint you have installed. In our demonstration and in our environment here, we have the free version of SharePoint, SharePoint Foundation installed. So we're limited in what we can do. Let's take a look at what we can do to make these edits, and I'll mention some of the things that you would do differently if you had the standard or the enterprise version. So let's go out to our SharePoint site. And in our SharePoint site, it's from our newly created one. We still have our reporting services error because the cube has not yet processed. But from here, we have a couple things: important dates, project work items. We can scroll down and see our product backlog and when the report was last updated, etc. We have a recent check-in. All of these things are nice to see, but we might want to configure it in different ways. This is our project dashboard. We have another dashboard here, like my dashboard, and this shows my tasks, my bugs, and we may want to say, you know what, I like my dashboard, but I want another dashboard. We can do that by simply saying copy dashboard. That's going to create a second copy of it. It'll copy exactly what's in here, and we can give it a new name. So rather than my dashboard, let's make this, I don't know, my other dashboard. And I'm going to give it a title. I'm going to use my other dashboard as the title as well. And you know what? I'm going to get rid of spaces in my name. I don't like spaces in URLs simply because they get %20 thing on there. I just don't like it. So I'm going to copy this dashboard. It'll be my other dashboard.aspx. And here we are. And at this point, you'll see I have my dashboard here, and I can start to do things like configuring my SharePoint page. And so to do that, I'm going up here to administration, and let's edit this page. And we might want to change the behaviors of some of these items. I might add a web part here as a header, and there's lots of web parts. If I click add a web part, I can see some of the available ones to me. And I might have things that are blog, content roll-up, forms, collaboration. I have a bunch of Team Foundation server ones, like go to a work item web part or a recent check-in web part. I could add those right up to the top if I wanted. A work item summary web part, all of those things. I'm not going to add another web part. I'll leave that blank, but I'll scroll down here and take a look at my tasks. And I can highlight my tasks. There's a little drop down over here. And from here, we can edit this web part. And we can make some changes to the web part itself. And when you edit the web part, you can scroll over and see what's involved in this web part. And over here, I can see some information about that web part. Should it have a fixed height? Yes, 188 points. Should it have a fixed width? Yes, you might want to change that. The title is My Tasks. It's based off of a custom query. We could change the query it's based off of and show something completely different if we wanted. A custom query, we can edit it right here, or we could select an existing query. But I'm going to edit the query. And I'm going to take this assigned to me off. And this is going to be all open tasks, any tasks that aren't closed. And click OK. So now this is going to be showing me all tasks, not just my tasks. So I might rename this to all tasks. Let's leave it at all tasks. And let's click OK. Or apply. And this is a new work item, a new template here. Even I don't have any tasks not assigned to me either. But now we have all tasks available here, and we've made that customization to the page. We can also do things like make a home page. We can change the title bar. We can change this down the side. All of that is really listed here when you're doing the settings and edit the pages. When I'm done, I simply click Stop Editing. It'll save that. My other dashboard is now available to me, and all of these things now are laid out. I could go here as well and delete any of these items. Basically, a lot of things I can do to be fairly flexible with the page here in SharePoint. Now, if you happen to be in SharePoint Standard or SharePoint Enterprise, you have a few more capabilities. Rather than the project dashboard, the relatively simple project dashboard, if you happen to be in Enterprise, you can light it up with a little bit more information. It might show you Excel services reports. Those are Excel reports that are uploaded directly to it. And you can set up a whole different standard. You can select from 3 different styles of template that appear here on the page. But when you're in the SharePoint Foundation one, you're limited to just this type of view and then editing it to make it the way you want it to look. A lot of times you want to take one of your SSRS reports, your SQL Server Reporting Services reports, and expose them and display them up on the portal. And you want to put them up on your web portal. So let's take a look at how we might do that. Well, the first thing we're going to need is to open up IE and basically see how it's done inside the portal. So let's go to our web portal for this one. And we're going to go to the, let's see, the My App site would be a good one. We've entered some data, so now you can see our burn down and hours and task burn down. That all looks good. And we like these 2 reports, and these reports come out of SQL Server Reporting Services. So let's take a look at that. We're going to then go in, and that's actually hosted on another server. That one's SRV 19430/reports. And in the reports, we're going to drill into the TFS reports and go find some of those reports. They're in the My App collection. And under My App, they're in the dashboards area. And if we take a look at dashboards, we have our burn down and burn rate. And if we opened up this burn down report and looked at it, it'll look pretty much exactly the same as what we saw on the other one. There it is. So you can see kind of our burn down and what we need to achieve it. A couple things you can see: work item is task, its measurement is hours of work. We could change that to the number of work items and some other things. And then up on the top up here, it's got a URL that points to it, the item path here, the TFS, default collection, burn down, etc. And you can kind of see the whole website here, where it's located. That's going to become important soon. Let's in fact go back and take a look at our burn rate. And actually, if I take our cumulative flow, I think it was just simply a copy of the burn down. But if we take our burn rate, it's nice and condensed. It's a nice clean one. Yep, this is a nice small burn rate. Here's the URL We're going to come back to that in a moment. Go back to our project dashboard, and we can take a look at where these come from. So for instance, our burn rate, hours per day, etc. If we click it, you can see the URL down at the bottom. It's a TFS redirect. The type is to this report and report name. I'm going to go ahead and click that for you. And what it does is it goes to the app tier and does a TFS redirect to the appropriate location on TFS 1430, which happens to be the database server where it's served from. So you see how these things can all come back and forth, that redirection that gets us there. We can also take a look at status on all iterations, stories, progress, etc., as being some related type reports. Here's some progress we've made on user story A and user story B. How many hours are remaining? How much have been completed? So this little report here could be quite a nice little report to see potentially out for our report viewer if we wanted to see it there. So let's go back if we can. I'm going to scroll back back to our project dashboard. And on our project dashboard, I want to look a little bit more deeply into what these things do. And to do that, I'm going up to edit the page. And we can take a look at how we're actually visualizing these. And if I go down to, for instance, task burn down, and in the little drop down here, I can see edit the web part. We're going to click edit the web part. And from here, you can scroll over and see what types of web part it is. It's a page viewer web part. It's located here, WAC sites, WAC default collection. If I keep going over, my app _ layouts. This is where Microsoft puts kind of its private stuff. And then that's where our TFS redirect comes in. That's our ASPX page. In fact, we can blow it up with this button here. And you can see where it's pointing to. So what we want to do, if we want to copy this, we can simply copy and paste it somewhere else. If we wanted to, for instance, create another web part that pointed to a new report that we wanted to see. So here it is. You can see the report name here is dashboards burn down and show toolboard. Yes, yes, yes. So we can copy this. I'm going to just Control C, click cancel. And that's basically how we can start to understand what this report is. Now let's add our own report. And to do that, I'm going to go add one right up at the top and add a web part here. And the report we want is in media and contact, and it's just a page viewer report. Very simple. It's just going to add an entire page viewer as an iframe. Once we did that, here it is. We can open the tool pane to see it, scroll across, and then we need to specify a link. I like to just open this up, and rather than try to find a direct link, I use that redirect.aspx. I prefer it because that way when I decouple this or detach the collection and re-add it, etc., the details here, it's able to find the report that we need rather than do a direct URL right to that report. If we change the report server, if we move things around, it would fail. Now it will continuously work as long as we're pointing to the right server as part of our reports. So here we are, got a lot of details. The report name is dashboards / burn down. Now we want to change that. That wasn't the one we wanted. So let's go back and see what other one we can have. And to do that, I'm going to click OK, just so it's in here so we don't lose it. But I'm going to go here to our burn rate report, and we're going to go back. And instead of dashboards, let's potentially show our project management stories progress report that we saw earlier. And here's our stories progress report. So I can go up here and I can kind of see the impact right here. It's my app, and then it's under this project management stories progress. I'm going to just copy that. Go back to the project dashboard. Now there's a little bit of fussing about to get everything to work right. So I'm going to go down a little bit and just paste it. I've got a little F in there evidently, which is going to be a problem. And the report name equals project management. This %2F is the \, and then stories progress. That's what I'm going to want to copy. And I'm going to paste it very carefully over the dashboards and burn down right there. Okay. Once I've done that, we can delete this from down here because that'll just mess things up. Now we have show toolbar equals 0. We've got some width and height specified in here as to how wide it should be, and we might want to bump that up and make it a little bit bigger. We could potentially do maybe 640, and the height we could bump up to 300 or something like that. Again, you'll have to do some experimentation with all of these things, and that's that location of the site. Now we can test that link. Fingers crossed that we've got the link correct. Not able to find it. There's a report parameter width that was not defined in this report. Not a problem. We're going to go back to our project dashboard, rip that open, and let's get rid of width and height. In fact, we might want to get rid of the show toolbar equals 0 as well. Not all reports have all parameters available to them. So let's click OK. Apply this again, and let's test that link one more time. Well, I guess we don't even need to test the link. There we can see it. Looks a little on the squished side, so we may want to expand out this web part. And to do that, we can do the expansion here as part of the web part itself. So it's got an appearance thing. And the first thing is the title of page viewer is wrong. We want user story progress. And we can specify the height here. It's going to adjust it to fit the zone, but we might want to say, you know, we really do want to adjust this to be 300 pixels. The width will adjust to fit the zone. That's probably okay. We can look at some more advanced topics here, allow minimize, allow people to export the data, etc. The layout, what zone, etc. All of those sorts of things that we can specify. And just again, standard SharePoint. And let's hit OK. And now we can see our user story progress report, and we've uploaded it right at the top. Now we do still have a scroll bar. We might want to change that, but we can see what's happening and what's going on. Let's stop editing. And now here is our final page where our user story progress has been added. So in this demonstration, we went through kind of some crazy stuff to go in and look at how we can take a report that sits in our reporting system and show it inside of SharePoint. Many times, the reporting capabilities that you have out of the box with SQL Server reporting services are sufficient, or you're going to be using Excel to do reporting rather than building SSRS reports. But occasionally, you want to build out your own set of reports. And to do so, you use something called RDL. It's the Report Definition Language. And once you've built that report, you can then upload those reports right onto your reporting infrastructure so that you can see those reports at any time and people can subscribe to them and do all of the other things that you would do with SQL Server reporting services. Let's take a look at how that might be done. First, we're in SQL Server reporting services, and we're going to drill into TFS reports, the default collection, and my app to do some changes. Now, under here, I've got a few dashboards that I really like. I've got a burn rate and a burn down, but I may want more details. I might want more of this. So let's take a look at how we might do that. I want to see this little drop down that you see here. One of the things you can do is download. So I can download my burn down and go ahead and save that locally. That's going to pull it down and save it locally. If I open up that folder, you can see it's now downloaded, and then I could make changes to it. Now I have another RDL report called the cumulative flow diagram, and that's the one I'm going to want to upload to this site so I can have more information. And another report, basically a CFD or a cumulative flow diagram, is a lean software development report that shows progress through states over time. Let's go ahead and do that upload. Right here we can just click upload a file, and we're going to browse to that file, and in our case we'll select the cumulative flow diagram. We need to give it a name. It'll default to a cumulative flow diagram, just the name of the RDL file. I might want to put spaces. I can choose to overwrite if it exists, which it doesn't, but in case I was uploading it multiple times with some testing. Now I click OK, and the file is now uploaded. And it shows the progress made as work items transition through states, etc. So now I have that cumulative flow in addition to the burn down and the burn rate. So in this demonstration, you've seen how we can download an RDL file, how we can then potentially go and make changes to it somewhere else, and then upload another RDL file with a different report that we can then see inside of SQL Server Reporting Services. In general, TFS does a brilliant job of just keeping the reporting up to date. So for instance, when you make changes to TFS and someone adds a work item, checks in code, interacts in some way, what happens is that's stored in the SQL Server Transactional Database Store. Now, by default, every 6 minutes, that's brought into a TFS data warehouse structure. And then every hour, by default, all these are changeable, that's moved into an OLAP cube and processed into an OLAP cube, which we can point Excel at and slice and dice and do all sorts of other things that you would do with an OLAP structure. Now, sometimes we need to rebuild the warehouse. That can happen because we created some conflicting changes. Maybe we use the same name for a TFS field, a data field, in two different team project collections, and they conflict. That may be a case. There might be other cases where we need to rebuild that data warehouse if the reporting isn't working. So how do we do that? How do we go about doing that? And that'll be the focus of this demonstration. Now, the first way is by far the easiest, and that is to simply open up the administration console. When you're in the TFS admin console, you can take a look at all of the areas under the application tier, and one of those is reporting. If we click on reporting, there's a nice little summary. Everything seems to be working. It's configured and the jobs are enabled. It's currently idle, meaning it's not processing. We can stop those jobs. We can do some edits, and we can start a rebuild. Basically, if we click Start Rebuild, it destroys the data warehouse, it destroys the OLAP cube, and it rebuilds everything from scratch by pulling data from the transactional store. So we can click Start Rebuild, and at this point, it gives us a warning. It's going to take maybe a significant amount of time. Usually it's pretty fast if you have less than about a few hundred megabytes in TFS. If you're getting up into the gigabyte or hundreds of gigabyte range, it can be a substantial amount of time, kind of like a Christmas break kind of time. But in the most part, it'll finish in a few hours for most teams, or over a weekend if you have a relatively large implementation. You simply click OK, and you're done. Another way to do that same thing, but not from a UI, is to use the command prompt. So if we go into the command prompt, there's a tool called TFS config. And if I'll put a / to see all of the various commands that we have available to us. There's several different commands. One of those is rebuild warehouse, and that rebuilds the database and the warehouse. So again, just like the other one, it rebuilds both of them. So we can type TFS config and then rebuild warehouse, and to show the commands that we can do here. And here we pass in analysis services. You might need to pass in some other details potentially, but it rebuilds that database and the relational database as well. If you want to rebuild only the cube, you can pass in the WAC analysis services parameter, and that will only do the analysis services. Or you can pass in WAC all, which is the default that builds both. Couple gotchas or things that you may need to consider. If you rebuild the cube, that's fine. You might have something in the cube that just needs to be reprocessed. But if you rebuild the data warehouse, it doesn't make much sense to rebuild it and not rebuild the cube, because the changes in the data warehouse need to be propagated to the cube. So generally, if you're going to do a full rebuild of the data warehouse, it'll be followed by a rebuild of the cube. Not necessarily, but that's why there's not a parameter here to just do the data warehouse. So this is probably the second easiest approach. And if you pass in only analysis services, you can just rebuild the cube. Now, but what if you want to rebuild just the TFS data warehouse and not the cube? We can do that as well. But in this case, we're going to be going through something quite different, and that's going into the web services directly. So you'll go to http://localhost:8080 TFS Team Foundation WAC Administration WAC v3.0 WAC Warehouse Controller Service.asmx. Whew, quite a mouthful. You'll probably need to go out to Google or Bing to find this, or DuckDuckGo, whatever your favorite search engine is, and find that location. Once you're there, there's three things: process warehouse, process analysis database, and get process status that you care about. So if we just wanted to process the warehouse, we could select process the warehouse for a given collection, or by default all collections, and we can specify a job name in here. We don't need to specify anything. We can just hit invoke, and it'll tell us true. It is now reprocessing just the data warehouse. I mean, if we want to go back in and see how that's working, we can also do so, and that's through the get processing status, and that's covered in another module. We can also process the analysis database. And if you do that, you do have to pass in a parameter. There's full and incremental. I'm just going to use full and invoke, and that will then say true. It's now executing a full rebuild of that. So I did it three ways in this. We talked about using the UI, by far the simplest, and it automatically, with no other input, will rebuild the data warehouse and the cube. You can use the command line tfsconfig/rebuild warehouse, which by default also rebuilds both. You can pass in a parameter that says only rebuild the cube in that one. So we can only rebuild the cube. And then the last one we showed was this web service where we can do things like just rebuild one or the other. Team Foundation Server provides something called the source and symbol server. Now, the nice thing about that server is that it allows you to do some pretty crazy stuff during your builds. So you build your code, that code is then indexed. That index is stored with source and symbol information in that server. And then later on, when people are walking through the code or debugging a particular version of the code, they can step through the code at that particular version. So the source and symbol server is a very powerful tool to help debugging, etc. In fact, Microsoft provides a source and symbol server for the entire .NET framework. You can connect to it and then actually step through the code while you're debugging potentially some .NET application. So we want to set up our own source and symbol server. Now, it sounds pretty complicated, but in reality, a source and symbol server is painfully simple. It's simply a file share. So let's set up our first source and symbol server to use. Now, I'm out on this server. It's a server somewhere, and I'm going to open up Windows Explorer and drop into the C drive. And this just happens to be where I have my drops location. I'm going to add a source and symbol server, new folder. We'll simply call it source and symbols. Source and symbols. That's it. That's our source and symbol server. Let's right click it and go ahead into the properties so we can share it. We can go into advanced sharing, either one. We're going to share this folder as the source and symbols, and then we can add some permissions to it. Now, I'm going to add everyone permission to allow. However, you may want to be restrictive in this place. I don't know. My default is to open it up to all of your development staff to make it easy for them to debug through, plus probably all of your testing staff as well. So let's apply this. And we now have our source and symbol server. To validate that we can get there, we want to just take a look where it's located, close it, and make sure that we can browse there with a Windows Explorer. So this is SRV 19432. And we want to go to the source and symbols directory. And sure enough, there we are. It's available. We can get through it for our network. And in a later video, we're actually going to show consuming this and publishing our sources and symbols out to this directory.